Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. We are here as we bravely continue on in the offseason here. We are in the dead of summer, the dog days of summer, if you will. Although I don't know about you, Mark, the Olympics lifting my spirits.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, not a lot of sports on TV this time of year, typically, right? As much as, don't get me wrong, like, I watch a decent bit of Major League Baseball, but you're looking for some variety, and I just refuse to watch preseason football, just as a life rule. I say that as we're recording this, I think the Hall of Fame game, or I don't know if they even still call it that anymore, but I think is kicking off as we record. But so the Olympics have been a nice thing to have on, just kind of to watch. And if there's nothing brings our country together, Mark, quite like instantly having hot takes about sports we've never watched before. Like I feel like that really brings us together.
So Joe, we give you 6 months to train. What could you be an Olympian in?
Archery, probably.
Archery?
Yeah,
I as a kid, and I don't know that I was at Olympic level. The problem is you really wear out this. You have to learn to keep that elbow in, or else you're going to have a lot of elbow pain.
Yeah, that's true. It is a more technical sport than I think people realize. I too, as a Ute, mostly actually in high school, I shot a bow a decent bit. It's also just that's one where, and look, obviously, the bit set aside, neither of us are doing anything in the Olympics, even with 6 months of training, right? But just to be clear, because I don't want us to get Twitter messages. It's like from a guy who's like a guy who's an Olympic hopeful in archery. That's like, well, you wouldn't last a day in art. You're right, I wouldn't, but just for the bit. So I did shoot a bow a little bit in high school with my dad, and so I do have some, like, I wouldn't be foreign to it, right? And then also it's a sport where, like, there is a fitness element. Like it takes actually a lot of strength to hold that bow taut while you're looking, at your target and get it just so. But it's not one where you need to totally transform your cardiovascular fitness, right? So many of these sports, I would just have to get in so much better shape than what I am right now, right? Like I love the handball, like team handball is my favorite random sport that comes on once every 4 years. I would be gassed after 5 minutes, So it would have to be something that I wouldn't have to totally transform my body for. Right. And so with archery, I would just need the practice of the actual sport, not so much having to go run mile after mile after mile to get into better shape. So what about you, Mark? Where are you at on that?
Oh, I don't probably nothing at this stage in my life, but earlier, I don't know. As a younger man, I would have loved to try to get into the middle distance running, like a 10K.
That's right.
Or something like
you are
that.
A runner.
Yeah. I obviously can't do it now, but back in the day, I was a little quicker. So, but it would be interesting to go through the whole Olympic training and to have that kind of coaching and just see what you can maximize. Probably. You have to be gifted enough athletically. Genetics play such a big part in achieving at that level. But it would be cool just to see.
What about shooting, Mark? Are you more comfortable with a gun than you are with a bow?
Probably, but I don't know, man. That's shooting at that level. That's challenging. Although my grandfather was a sniper in World War II, so I do have the genetics to perform
it's in your blood,
right? His stakes were a lot higher than Olympic games.
Indeed, yeah.
But yeah, he told me a few stories.
Well, see, there you go.
Yeah.
Did you see the internet viral sensation of the Turkish shooter? Most of the time, these shooters in the shooting competition, whether it's the rifle or the pistol, they come out with kind of like special like glasses on, like they almost look like not visors, like kind of like a goggle type thing, and they just look geared up, right? And this shooter for Turkey, and I didn't see him compete. I've just seen like the internet content since then, comes out in like an untucked shirt with like no special gear on at all. It's like he just walked into the venue and just won a silver medal.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, came out of Lowe's. That's right. He was looking at some toilets.
Right.
And then walked into the competition. And he's like, yeah. And won himself a silver medal,
How about
just
that?
What a hero.
Total dad
anyway,
move.
That's right. That is very dad. Yeah, just be like, I got it. I've been doing this forever. Just give me the gun.
Just get on my way. I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
No directions. Yeah. I'm not reading the directions. I'm just going to do it.
Yeah. I'm just going to do this by feel. Yeah. And the guy won a silver medal. God bless him. Real quick before we get to any of the baseball stuff here today, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by Pitch Logic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level. See pitchlogic.com for more information. All right, we got a couple action items here today, Mark. The first of which is, we teased this last week because the news broke in time for our podcast last week, but we weren't really prepared to talk about it yet. So we kicked can down the road to this week to talk about one of the downstream effects of what is known as the House settlement with the NCAA. From baseball standpoint, the short version is that teams will now be able to go up to 34 full scholarships. Basically, long story short, there will be no more partial scholarship sports. As long as the school is willing to spin to that, like that, they will not be legislated as partial scholarship sports, I guess is the best way to put it. So that's the thing. Now we still have some details to iron out. Of course, there's going to be there's some thought that 34 scholarships might also mean a 34-man roster limit, which has its own questions that we can get into. So understand that as we record this on August 1st, there are some questions that have really yet to be answered. And there's some time to answer because this does not affect the 2025 baseball season, because those players are already arriving on campus here pretty soon, and some are already there, and the rosters have already been more or less recruited. So, it's the 2026 season we're talking about. But what was your just general, as someone, Mark, who has covered college baseball for a couple of decades now and has seen this entire conversation around the 11.7 for, the entire time you've covered the sport, what was your reaction when you realized that, this thing that seemed like a far-fetched dream over even as recently as maybe a year ago is now right on our doorstep?
Yeah. It was surreal because we've had 11.7, shoved down our throats for as long as I can remember. And regardless of what anyone said, anyone did, a lot of chances to change it, and it never changed. And we kind of assumed it kind of never would. Programs cry poverty, even under the best conditions. And now, oh boy, now you're going to open this up in one more drastic change that the sport has had in the last few years, and there's an opportunity to really blow up college baseball as we know it, where players have, many players have borrowed money to go to college to play baseball. And there's an opportunity, at least, at some schools, that would go away. And then you add in the NIL to that, and you actually come out of college baseball with more money than you went into it with, which the guys, 3 years ago, 4 years ago would be, oh my God, I was an All-American and I owe all this money, right? If you didn't have a great pro career. So I do think that it's just weird, right? I haven't quite come to grips with it yet, and I don't know what to make of how it's going to affect competitive equity, because as we mentioned, the 34 scholarships comes with a 34-man roster, and in today's world, it's 40. It was 35 pre-COVID, and it was, and so those are players that in today's world would go, to the top programs, and now there won't be room for them. So they're going to go elsewhere. So what does that mean to, from a competitive standpoint? So all of these things that we don't know yet, and we haven't got into this, and I don't want to filibuster here, but I do think that, when that 34 is counted, is the whole domino. Okay. And I'll let you jump into this before I take all your talking points. But that to me is the big, that's what we need to know in order to understand what the impact's truly going to be.
Yeah, and I would urge listeners who really want to get in the nitty gritty on that. Not that Mark and I aren't going to have an informed conversation about it, because I'd like to think we will here in a second. But on the main D1 Baseball podcast, Mike Runes kind of went into depth on this, and his perspective is important because he's actually been in the room when you're cutting down a roster. Right. He's been in the room when you're allocating scholarships. He was a coach in high level Division I baseball, so he does have a perspective that Mark and I just will never have. So if you're interested in kind of a nitty gritty perspective on this, a little more detailed perspective, I would urge you to go listen to the episode that we recorded last week. But you're right, Mark, that is the key detail. It's not even necessary. I mean, yes, the roster number is important, but when you have to be at that number is perhaps even more so. And because it does change. If it's, if it's 34 by the fall, boy, your player evaluation better be right on point, because you're just gonna be riding with that 34 the whole time, and there's no such thing as, hey, we thought this guy was gonna play every day for us, and it turns out that we misevaluated, or it turns out he was nursing some sort of nagging injury we weren't totally aware of, like in the summer, or whatever circumstance, right? So. And there are some coaches I've heard secondhand. I've not talked to anyone firsthand who's had this thought, but I've heard secondhand from some coaches that are like, honestly, I like the idea of 34 in the fall because it puts the onus on coaches to be good evaluators, and that's our job. Yeah. And then in some programs, and look, this is within the rules as they existed forever, and including today, we'll go into the fall with these massive rosters, which gives you a lot of slack, right? Because if you're major conference program X with a history going to Omaha, and you've got 50 dudes in the fall, like all 50 of those guys are good. All 50 of them could play at a whole bunch of other places. And ultimately you can only keep 30, roughly 35 of them in today's world. So getting to 34 in the fall would be tough in some ways, but I think also a challenge that, the coaches who really pride themselves on evaluation, I think will be interested in that challenge. Now, of course, there are other things to consider there. And I'll give it back over to you, Mark, on this point, which to me, it's also that I just feel like there has to be some special dispensation given to what do you do when you've got a kid who is going to miss the season because of Tommy John or whatever, right? Because what we don't want to have happen, what we don't want the unintended consequence to be is, oh, this is a pitcher who is having Tommy John, he's going to miss the season. Well, he's kind of a fringy roster guy anyway. Let's just cut him. Right. And then not have him count on our roster. That is not what anybody wants to see, right? So there's a lot of things into this, but I'm with you generally that when the 34 is as important as the 34 number itself.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of people who like it to be pre-fall practice. So maybe mid-August. And you do that, and like you talked about, it's all about your evaluation. You got your 34 that you pick, and you ride with them. And if you get a couple of guys hurt in the fall, and you have another guy who's homesick and decides, hey, this place is not for me, then maybe you start the spring with 31, and then the normal wear and tear of the season, you may lose a few more. And what happens if they're all at a position, right? One particular spot, like a catcher, right? You lose a couple of catchers, and you're down to your third string catcher that you really weren't depending on, and then having a backup infielder catching, right? Those are the kinds of concerns that would accumulate under this pre-fall counter. The other thing to consider, and a coach brought one when I wrote a story on this that posted on Thursday. One of them mentioned that our our windows don't line up. The portal closes before the draft. Okay. So you don't know who's going to be drafted. You don't know who's not going to be drafted. And you certainly don't know if they're drafted, who's going to sign. Okay. So all of that plays into your roster size. And if you have to pick that roster at 34, you're holding a spot for that stud that got drafted or could be drafted just in case he comes back. So, but you probably are thinking, well, he's probably not coming back. So you're having this extra guy. Well, he doesn't sign. So now you're over. And the portal's closed. So what does that kid do? He can't even go through fall at that point, right? He can't go to another team. The portal's closed. So that is something that I would like to see addressed. Whether, hey, if you're on the cut list, then you're open to the portal. The only problem is all the other teams have set their limit as well. So it just kind of cascades, right? Because there may not be any open spots. So it's a challenge to do it that early, even though I don't know that a lot of us like the whole concept of, yeah, you bring in 50 and you cut them in November, and then they're scrambling to go to JC or go to D2 or just stay in school and try again next year, right, at the end of the fall. So just based on the calendar, there's not it's not a clean solution either direction that you go. So, smarter people than us can talk about it and try to figure out a way to do it. But, on the good side of things, you could have a few schools, especially people who listen to Highway to Hoover, have 34 people on scholarship. And that would be amazing for the sport, because it really would open doors to kids from families who just can't afford to send their kids to school, and they choose something else. Right. And now that door would be open for them, where for years and years it hasn't been.
Yeah, it's a great point. That's a good transition to kind of one of my next things about this was that first we should say that we don't know anything for certain, but it stands to reason that the 16 teams in the SEC are going to fully fund. I would be shocked if they didn't, because those programs can afford it, and B, if you're going to be the one or two that aren't, you're going to be in real trouble in the league. So you're going to kind of have to, right? And this doesn't really affect the SEC, but we can get into some of the higher, the farther reaching tendrils of this, because I imagine we probably have some folks listening who are fans or alums of Sunbelt schools or Big South schools or whatever else. And you've heard talk, and I get this will be the case. I can guarantee you there are going to be a number of schools that are going to stick at 11.7, or they might go to 13 or 15, or, I mean, heck, for that matter, there are some schools out there right now that have 6, and we just you don't know that unless you know, right? So there will be schools that fall short of that, of going to a full 34. And it's on, I would love to have, and this, I'm going to come at this. Mark and I talked about this a little offline, and Mark stopped me short because we wanted to save it. It was one of those things we wanted to save for the show, but I'm going to admit what I'm going to say here comes from a place of ignorance. So, like, if somebody wants to email us or reach us on social media, like, because I am genuinely interested in this, for that matter, like, hey, come on the podcast if you're an expert on this stuff. But like, what does a scholarship cost a school, right? Let's say, I don't want to pick a school because I don't want to make that sound like it's an informed example. It wouldn't be, but I just don't want anybody to assume that. Whatever's public school down the road costs $30,000 a year.
Yeah.
Okay. There, Mark picked that, not me.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's Alabama, so it costs $40,000
I have
a year.
Experience with that.
Yes. Okay. Let's just, for easy math, let's just do $40,000. So, but in that, the University of Alabama is not losing $40,000 necessarily, and they're not paying $40,000 a year. But yes, there are costs associated with it, especially with athletes. You've got the training table supplies. You've got, the food with the fueling stations. You've obviously got the opportunity cost of housing. You got to house an athlete that could go to somebody else. And I get that, yes, theoretically, that the student athlete signed up for sociology 1301 is taking up a class space that could be taken by some freshman from Opelika who is going to be paying full freight. Mm-hmm. Right. So I get all that, but it's just like, I guess I just don't understand the full accounting of it, because I don't think it's as simple. I guess my big point is this. I don't think it's as simple as, okay, if we're adding, again, for easy math, 20 more scholarships, it's a little more than that, but 20 more scholarships, you can't just do 20 times the cost of attendance. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Again, I'm admitting ignorance on this, but I've always been fascinated by that schools will talk about the affordability of we can't go to 34 or whatever else. And it's like, okay, well, I believe you, but why? Like, what is the actual cost of a scholarship? I just be kind of fascinated. And that does not apply to SEC schools. I think all 16 are going to be fine. That's not really not a factor for them, but for other schools it is. And I would just kind of love to know more about why that is.
Well, I don't have your answer, but I can kind of advance the conversation a little bit, because, part of bringing in partial scholarship student athletes is that they are paying something to go to school. So if you have a 34-person roster and they're on in today's world, 11.7 scholarships, then a lot of them, the majority of them, are paying something, where in tomorrow they won't pay anything. Okay. So there is some cost there, and it's not just, and we're a baseball podcast, so we're talking about baseball, but there's the whole Title IX thing where, hey, you add 22 scholarships for baseball, you're adding 22 for a female sport as well. And that's, that's adding to that cost that, or is subtracting from the tuition costs that you're getting in today's world, and subtracting from what you would get in tomorrow's world. And how much of that, I don't know. To your point, how much is tuition worth? It seems like to me you're kind of pulling it out of one pocket and putting it in the other. But still, I do think there's some cost to that, or obviously everyone would do it. So the part that's going to be fascinating for me is to see if the SEC leads the charge, and, hey, we're fully funded, go right ahead, who follows? Because if someone at the top of the sport decides, no, we can't afford to do this, we're only going to give X, and it's not 34, then that's justification for others to follow suit and go, hey, if they can't do it, we certainly can't do it. And for the Big Ten, for example, tons of money with the football contracts coming in, but most of those are not fully funded. So you're talking about, what do you value and where do you spend your money, and is how important is baseball? And certainly is very important to the Just Me More crowd, but where is it for everyone else? And if that's the case, then the SEC, who's already in this penultimate spot up here, the best in the sport by far, is what does that mean to competitive equity? Does it grow? And maybe it does. And that's, while that might be fun for people who like to poke their chest out about conference superiority, I don't think we really want one conference to just totally dominate. And if that's the case, do you even continue with D1 as we know it with 300 plus schools? Does it shrink? And maybe it's the SEC plus a few others competing at one level, and everyone else, or maybe there's different groups. So anyway, I kind of bounced around a little bit there, but still, I do think those are the kinds of things that concern us with this great news. Hey, there's an opportunity to give these guys full scholarships, but what does it do to the sport? And that's, and I don't think anybody knows. And I don't think we're going to know. We understand what these administrations can afford.
Yeah, it reminds me, it made me think of something. You mentioned if there's a big name program that comes out and says we can't afford this, that it does kind of open the door for others to maybe think about that. Reminds me a little bit of the third paid assistant debate from 5 years ago or whatever it was, and obviously now we've gotten that, so it's beyond that. But the time that it did not take, I think it was around 5 years ago. There was it felt to me like there was an assumption that we were just going to get there. Like it was kind of a done deal. And then we get to the finish line and you start to hear of some defections, and suddenly it felt like a house of cards that just kind of fell over once some people kind of raised their hand and said, like, I don't think this is a good idea for whatever reason. So yeah, that's a good thought, because I think there could be some parallels there where, schools that are, and I don't envy, by the way, there are going to be some athletic departments that get vilified for not fully funding, and not just in baseball, right? Like there are big time, whatever other men's sports, women's sports typically with Title IX have not had issues as much in this regard, but in the men's sports, right? Like soccer and track and field and whatever else, like people involved in those sports or invested in those sports are going to be upset about some of those decisions. But so I don't envy athletic directors or anyone else having to make these, to make these decisions. Right. But
one of the coaches I talked to said that, hey, it's going to be great. Hey, it's great that they allow you to give all these extra scholarships, but you got to for and just do the best you can. Right. And I think that's going to be the reality of this, because for a lot of programs, there's not extra money to pull from. Okay. Maybe you allocate it differently, but if the sum is the same, there's only so much wiggle room. And I think that's going to be what administrators are faced with over these next couple of years, as they try to plan for it and change the way that they're spending money. Maybe it's less facilities, maybe it's less, whatever, the trips or anything else you're spending money on. You're going to reallocate that towards personnel. And we thought that might go towards, NIL, but I think right now it's heading towards, funding scholarships. And then you've got the whole NIL bucket that's still there for a lot of programs, and very successfully, that, you still got to find money for that too. So it's, you keep squeezing the turnip. Eventually you're going to run dry.
Yeah. As we move on here, like that my thought is, you mentioned facilities. To me, that seems like one of the, cause you're right, that it's going to be moving money from one pocket to the other in a lot of cases. And I have to think that, because other areas where you can only cut so much, right? Like, okay, we can reduce travel costs. Well, okay, but you can't, like, you can only cut down on that so much, right? Like, you do have to actually go to games. Right. So, or pay for teams to come play you, right? A guarantee games and things like that. So you can only reduce that cost. So ultimately it's like, it comes down to things that are, more superficial, right? So maybe you do invest in, upgrading your pitching lab or whatever, but like, we were going to create a new, we were going to put new seats in the stadium, and now that project is maybe not as much of a priority, right? And so, if you're a fan of an SEC program that got their big facilities project in under the wire, like maybe you should be a little extra thankful, because maybe it won't change. I don't know. Mark and I don't know, but like, it does strike me as facilities might be a little where some of this money gets shifted a little bit. So, but we will find out. All right, let's talk a little bit of draft stuff, Mark. Draft deadline to sign was, as we record this, about 3.5 hours ago. So we have a full accounting of what's happening here and what didn't happen. To get us started here, we'll talk about a number of different things here. I'm going to read off kind of a menu of things that I found most notable. My apologies if I missed something. I think I got the broad strokes here, and then Mark, you pick from the menu what kind of stands out to you as most interesting or consequential or whatever there. So we've got Tyler Bell, 66th overall pick, going to Kentucky. spurning the Rays to go to UK. I wrote a story about that today, so go check that out if you've not done that. Ryan Prager going back to A&M. That's a big one. 3rd round pick of the Angels, going back to be A&M's returning ace on the staff. David Mershon and Travis Smith both signed within hours of the signing deadline. They were both, Mershon was already at Mississippi State. Travis Smith was transferring to Mississippi State from Kentucky. Both were drafted late. I think Mershon was 18th and Travis Smith was the 15th, I believe. So those happened at the very end. So kind of a tough day for Mississippi State in that regard. Jared Spencer, a transfer from Indiana State to Texas, did not sign as a 14th round pick. He's a big-armed left-hander from Indiana State, part of the very good Sycamores teams the last couple of years. As of today, another late signing, Florida commitment, Jaden Dubanowitz signs on the last day. Another late-round draft pick who decided to sign ultimately. Kentucky, as good as the news was with Tyler Bell, they had 4 incoming transfers drafted and signed between the 7th and 13th rounds. And then Brian Curley for Georgia, VCU transfer. Georgia had a couple of guys get drafted and signed from their transfer class. Brian Curley, a hard-throwing right-hander from VCU, is going to go to campus in Athens for the 2025 season. Mark, tell me what stands out from that menu, or something else, if something else came to mind. What stands out most from all that stuff?
Well, I think about Ryan Prager at A&M and how things looked. I mean, they lost in the national championship final game, okay? And then their coach leaves for their rival. And it seems like half the team jumps into the portal in the next few days. And not only do the bulk of those guys return, at least the most important ones all returned, then they get their ace back, who was drafted in the 3rd round, and all of us assumed he was gone, man. I mean, you don't come back if you're drafted in the 3rd round. And when you think about where that program, how low they felt with everything that happened, following the title game, and the momentum of the program and how it has totally flipped. And now this is one of the, I think they're going to be preseason number 1 at this point. I think it's them and LSU. Those are the number 1 and 2 teams in the nation. Whoever you want to pick, I won't argue with you. They're both going to be really good. So with Prager, and I understand that, when you go through something like this as a fan base, there's maybe you set your jaw and you dig deep, and you find that extra NIL money, and you use that to your advantage. And I think that's where A&M right now. They're a program on a mission. They were so close to taking it all last year. Maybe, if you're an A&M fan, you always wonder if Braden Montgomery and Shane Sadeo aren't injured. What happens? You never know. You might still lose, but you might not have, right? And now with this, you're going to get Prager back. You're going to have one of the best offenses in the country. They've added a ton of transfers to make it even stronger. I mean, to me, that's the biggest story out of this, is being able to not only salvage the portal, but to even get Prager back on top of that to make you one of the favorites heading into next year.
Yeah, there was some buzz going into the draft that, hey, A&M's going to make a real run at Prager and try to get him to come back. Because, this is going to sound like I'm like slighting him, and I don't mean it that way. It's just to draw a distinction between, like, he did not have Hagen Smith stuff, right? He had almost Hagen Smith results. So we knew, Prager was not going to be a top, 50 draft pick, right? And so you knew he was going to fall in kind of a range where it's like, hey, if A&M can get the money together, he might be interested in that. And so there was some buzz going into the draft. They were going to make a run at him, but then he gets drafted in the 3rd round. And to your point, you're just kind of like, oh, well, so much for that. If he'd been drafted in the 6th, I think maybe there'd been a different discussion, but it was the 3rd, and those guys just tend to sign. So yeah, huge for A&M. I'm with you that as of right now, I'd have them number 1. In fairness, I haven't, really you've done more digging on it than I have for a project we're working on. But yeah, that's kind of where I would look first. So shout out to Florida State though in the ACC. I think a team also in that mix, just out there. But sorry, Gator fans.
Yeah. So the other one, I mean, Tyler Bell, second rounder, freshman shortstop for Kentucky. I mean, you're drafted in like we talked about, Prager in the third. You're drafted in the second. You're typically not going to school, and now Kentucky has a switch hitting shortstop. It's going to be kind of bring tons of energy into the program. You bring in a guy like that, and honestly, Kentucky lost a ton of players, key players from that team last year. So having a centerpiece that can come in, and certainly he's talented. He'll have some older guys around him, and they brought in a bunch of transfers as well. But just that to me, just kind of that was just what they needed. They needed a centerpiece to next year's team. To at least from a talent standpoint, he's going to match up with anyone. So I think that was enormous. Couldn't come at a better time. Certainly, you always want to grab the second round shortstop, but this came at a great time for Nick's club. I do think that being able to have that, that guy that, I mean, we're all going to be eager to see him in February. I think that's enormous just from a program momentum standpoint. 2 great years in a row. Last year was probably the best in program history, right? Went to College World Series for the first time. Yep. So you follow that up with bringing a recruit like that in, and it just says a lot for where your program is.
Yeah, no doubt. And those things can feed on themselves, right? Especially if he's as good as advertised, right? When he gets on campus, the other high-end prospects see that and kind of see themselves in his shoes, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, a big deal there, not just from an on-field standpoint, but from a marketing standpoint. Think all that stuff that matters in college athletics. And so I wrote a piece on this on the site. So some of the details from that are interesting. One is that Kentucky had some things working for it in this recruitment. He's already 19, which helps on two fronts.
Years. Yeah.
Right. Is one, Tyler Bell knows that, hey, if I really ball out, it's just 2 years. Right. So I can kind of have to his point. And this is what he told me when I talked to him was, and I'm paraphrasing a little, but it was like, it's the best of both worlds. Like I can go to my dream school and play college baseball in the SEC. And then I can, if I work as, if I'm as good as I think I can be, then after 2 years, I'll get drafted and I'll go. So that and then the other front in which it helps is
play in the SEC,
right, exactly. And the other front in which it helped is that because he is 19, older for the class, there were some teams that just probably weren't interested in him. MLB organizations that weren't as interested in him as they otherwise would be. Yeah. Whether you think that's silly or not, I think sometimes it gets a little silly, but that is a factor. So he may not have been drafted as high as he otherwise would have. So maybe that helped a little bit in that regard. He's going to be glove over bat, but there is physicality. Like I think he's going to be a little more. And I'm not a scout, so don't take this to the bank. But we talked about Dylan Cupp at this time last year and said, look, if you're expecting Dylan Cupp to come in there to Starkville and be a program savior in terms of a centerpiece of your lineup, you're probably barking up the wrong tree because he's a defense first shortstop. Tyler Bell is as well, but I think there's more physicality right out of the gate. He's 6'1", 6'2", he's 190. He's got power potential, especially from the left side. The swing from the right side has a little more work to do on that, but at least from the left side, there's a real high end potential for him. So I do think there's a chance he hits. But the thing that's going to put him on the field on day one is the glove. He went to the same high school as Ryan Ritter, interestingly, former Kentucky shortstop. And that's kind of what Ryan Ritter was, right? Like, very good defensive shortstop who also was pretty good with the bat, but he was getting drafted for his glove. And I think that will be the case with Tyler Bell again. On the Mississippi State front, there was, I was starting to think that they were going to get both those guys, Mershawn back and Travis Smith. And, it's hard to know what to expect with Travis Smith because the talent's always been there, but he just never quite put it together at Kentucky. And there were some minor injury things this year for Smith with the Wildcats. And so I don't know. That was kind of like a lotto ticket for Mississippi State in some ways. Cause man, if you can unlock his stuff, like you've got a real guy, but Marshawn, right. Exactly. And State's going to need one of those, right. Going into next year. So, but Marshawn feels like the more impactful one, just because if he comes back, especially with Dakota Jordan having signed. Now, Dakota Jordan didn't go all the way down to the wire, but he came a couple days shy of going down to the wire. But when you lose Dakota Jordan, like you look at Marshawn as, okay, he's not the same player as Dakota Jordan. That's not my point, but he was going to be your centerpiece. Hunter Hines obviously is a very good power bat.
He was going to be fortunate to get him back. Yeah.
Right. But Hunter Hines is probably going to be like your leadoff guy, right? Like, and if not in a literal sense, then in a metaphorical sense of like the guy that everything revolves around David Marshawn. So not getting him back, I think is more impactful. So I think State will probably go out and see if they can, there's still some guys floating in the portal. I wouldn't be surprised to see State make a run at some of those guys, but at least for today, it's a little bit of a tough day for the Dogs.
Yeah, absolutely. And, getting Hines back, especially in hindsight, losing the people that they had is huge. But I still think Mississippi State needs a center fielder. They, with Marshawn is Pulliam the guy at second. You mentioned Cup earlier. That may be the middle of the infield. So I do think that losing Marshawn that's a huge blow for Mississippi State. One of the other teams that I don't think you mentioned them is that I think the draft was pretty good for them is Florida, because they got Colby Shelton back and they got Ty Evans back. And I honestly thought both of them were long gone. And being able to get proven SEC hitters returning, that means a lot for your club. And they've got some freshmen that they could have easily signed and didn't. So I think Florida, on paper, they look like one of the best teams in the country. And, they finished the year that way, but they certainly weren't that way for the regular season. So that's another club that I think the draft was kind to.
I think that's right. I think I was on Gainesville radio actually yesterday and got asked about that. And I think it's obviously Evans and Colby Shelton are very productive players. That's but also by bringing them back, you are also filling a couple of positions with guys who have been in the program, know what to expect, have been around the block, as opposed to transfer X or Y. And and sometimes the transfers are great, right? But there is a learning curve that you will not need with Colby Shelton and Ty Evans. And I have a sneaking suspicion that we'll get a little bit of a different Colby Shelton in 2025. I think in his heart of hearts, he didn't expect to be in college baseball again in 2025. And that can be kind of I don't know, obviously I've not talked to him about this, but that can be kind of a tough thing mentally. Humbling, when you just didn't have the season you wanted, and you were productive. I think it's 20 bombs still. But you just you didn't take the step forward you thought. And now you're back in college baseball. And
so many of us, I guess, questioned is a fair word, his transition to shortstop, and he ended up being a pretty good shortstop. So I would think the second year at shortstop, he could be that much better. And maybe if he continues to improve as much as he did from year 1 to year 2, from 2 to 3, maybe he's a professional shortstop. Certainly he improved a ton. And I had people tell me that, that he really blew them away with how much he'd improved defensively. So I do think that's a club. And I tell you another club that I really like what they've done and how the draft affected them is Georgia. When you lose that many players, and I know that they lost a couple to the draft, but from a transfer standpoint, but they really did a good job in the portal, bringing in guys who can contribute. They got three of their top pitchers from the end of the year returning, maybe 4 if you count Goldstein, who was injured for a bulk of the year. So it could be a really I think Georgia, they were, one game away from Omaha last year. that they could easily win that extra game and make it there in year 2 under Wes Johnson. So I think that the draft was kind to them in ways that it wasn't, say, to Mississippi State.
Yeah, it's, interestingly, I just pulled up our entire staff's like 8 for Omaha exercise. Mm-hmm. And I'm not doing this to like necessarily gloat about it because these are dart throws this time of year. Mm-hmm. But you and I both have Georgia in our 8 for Omaha for next year.
Feel good about it.
Yeah. And like, I think I've said this pretty consistently. I think even last regular season, I was saying something along these lines, but man, a rotation of Leighton Finley, Colton Smith, and then Zach Harris or Charlie Goldstein.
Right. Sign me up.
Yeah. I mean, there might be more raw talented rotations in the SEC because not that some of those guys are untalented, but it's just, you might have just more like blow it by you stuff rotations in the league, but I'm not so sure that won't be the best rotation in the league.
Yeah. And then you add the bullpen. You mentioned Curley, who, turned down pro money to come to Georgia, VCU transfer. And JT Quinn, who was a Friday guy for Ole Miss. You got Alton Davis, who was Alabama's closer, who was really good as a freshman and kind of took a step back last year. But those are some talented arms.
Yeah.
And Jordan Stevens is a guy who's going to push 3 digits as a JC transfer out of the bullpen. I mean, there's some dudes out there. So this could be a Georgia team that just picks right up where they left off last year, minus Charlie Condon in the middle of the lineup.
Yeah. That's obviously it's a big loss there. But then you start to look around it, and we kind of accidentally backed our way into doing a Georgia preview episode somehow. But like you look at the lineup they bring back even without Condon, and man, it's they're going to have some guys. So
they're going to match up with just about anybody. I mean, A&M's at another level, but offensively. But I think everywhere else, I mean, Georgia's right there.
Yeah. We have some, just before we get out of here, a quick, like, kind of public service announcements, some housekeeping, things of that nature. For the listeners, Mark and I have a series coming out of season in review / look aheads. Last offseason, we did a 1 season in review piece for each team. We are still doing that, but this time we are adding a little bit of a look ahead. So Mark's been diligently kind of looking around at draft information and returning rosters and a whole bunch of stuff to project out what starting lineups, benches, rotations, bullpens are going to look like for all 16 teams based on what we know now. Now, disclaimer, of course.
Sure to be wrong.
Sure to be wrong. He was working on these in July. So, right. You got to understand what we're dealing with. But I do think it's a fun exercise. Well, let me actually just throw it to you, Mark. Let you talk about it. Like, I mean, what was that exercise like for you?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I kind of started out, trying to understand who would be the best teams for next year. Okay, that's where it started. Because, A&M started to get a bunch of these guys back out of the portal, and I thought, well, they look really good. And then, okay, well, what about LSU? What about Florida? What about Tennessee? What about, X team? So, and it just kept going, and just trying to keep up with who left in the portal, who's returning in the portal, who'd you get from other teams, and then freshmen of impact, junior college transfers of impact. All of that, and trying to understand, okay, well, where do they all fit? Who can contribute? Who has the most returning talent, back? Maybe guys that weren't starters, but were kind of in the wings, waiting for their opportunity. Trying to figure out those things, and now, I mean, it's kind of been a work in progress over the last 3 weeks or so, and we're about ready to unveil it. So we're going to roll some out beginning on Monday, and it's going to be. I think it'll be kind of cool because not only do you get to see your team, but you get to see the teams you're going to face, and we're going to do it for Texas and Oklahoma as well. I mean, we'll do the full 16 and take our shot at entering the fall. Here's where you stand, all right, and then we'll do it again at the end of fall once we get more information from fall drills. But so this is such a fun part of the year because. You know what? Going into next spring, everyone's undefeated. This might be your year, right? So now you get to start your planning of, okay, what's our lineup going to look like? Who's going to pitch? Who's our bullpen guys, right? who are the freshmen or newcomers that I need to be aware of, those kinds of things. And we're gonna try to kick that off for you next week.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. So look for those starting on Monday. We'll basically do 4 a week for the next 4 weeks. That'll take us, believe it or not, to the doorstep of fall workouts really getting underway. SEC teams tend to go a little bit later than average, so it won't quite get us there, but it'll get us pretty doggone close. And, Mark and I will obviously have other stuff along the way. We always tend to find our way into various other things to put up on the site. So make sure you're staying tuned to SEC Extra. If you're listening to this and you're not a subscriber, I think it's a good time to get in. I know I always say that and I always believe it, but getting in now would get you all this kind of fall stuff we're going to be doing. We have some stories from the fall. We'll have some, just fall report type stuff, fall report adjacent stuff. You'll get these season in reviews and look aheads, but getting in now would also take you through next season. So you could kind of be along for the whole cycle, if you will. So good time for that. A lot of good stuff on the site now.
And you're not going to find something like this elsewhere. I mean, that's
right.
It's kind of our niche.
Right. Yeah. So, certainly on an individual team level, some beat writers might be doing this, although most of them are getting ready for football. So actually probably not. But certainly you're not going to get all 16 in one place done as comprehensively as we're going to be doing it. So looking forward to rolling those out. And of course, Highway to Hoover will continue to come to you once a week, asterisk. We reserve the right to take a week off here or there as the off season rolls on. But we don't really plan on doing a whole lot of that because we enjoy doing this week by week and kind of being your companion through a long off season as we barrel towards 2025. That is going to do it for this edition of Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at D1Baseball.com. Want to thank Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover. Thank you to Mark, as always, for joining me, and thank